Welcome to This Month in Security, a DevCentral podcast featuring contributions from Aaron Brailsford.
You know, it is relatively easy to breach an organization because usually soft, fleshy things.
Malcolm Heath.
Just from a basic sort of security perspective, it's better to fix things earlier than later. It's better to structure your architecture and stuff that it's in such a way that it's secure rather than try to bolt security on at the back end.
David Warburton.
What really fascinates me from a security point of view, now I like to kind of get geeky and nerd out about crypto stuff and all the latest technologies, but actually so much of security, like probably the most pivotal part of security is trust.
And Sander Vinberg.
The level of these guys was very high. Everybody in the room was kind of a hot shot. It was pretty wild to just be listening to discussion at that level.
I'm your host, Aubrey King with DevCentral, and we've got a great show for you today, so strap on those earbuds and get ready for This Month in Security.
Okay, well, that's it. We've got 1 month in the books for 2024. Welcome to This Month in Security, episode 18. And this month we're going to be highlighting a segment from our buddy Daniel Wolf, who is not only a DevCentral MVP, but also an engineer at Controlware. We're going to get to that a little bit later. Wanted to take a quick second to say happy 50th birthday to Dungeons and Dragons. So we know that it happened sometime in late January, 50 years ago. And I hope if you're a person that plays, that you go ahead and celebrate sometime this week by doing something special with D&D. So before we get into that, though, I did want to take a second to mention we've got a roundtable like usual as well. But before we even get to the roundtable, we've been doing something recently celebrating This Week in Security and bringing This Week in Security into the podcast as a bonus segment. Now, This Week in Security is a couple years long running segment on DevCentral, but it is definitely one of the most read recurring articles that we've got, and it's put forth by the security incident response team if you're not somebody that already consumes it. So they utilize rotating editors, right? So you're not getting the same viewpoint every single week over and over and over again. We got a couple of different people that have different interests, and it keeps things really, really neat. Although I got to say, it's kind of cool having paid attention to This Week in Security for a long time now. Some of the little bits that go in between week to week, like not too long ago, we had a couple weeks in a row where, two different editors both did segments on furries. I don't know how, but like furries in hacking happened. And so those kinds of things happen between. So it is, they managed to keep things not only, a fresh viewpoint, but also fairly entertaining. So we wanted to just take a moment to show you what it's all about. If you don't consume it, please consider it. And subscribe to the podcast, and you're going to get it as a bonus. So, without further ado, has got a familiar face this week.
This Week in Security is January 15th through 21st, and our editor for the week is me. I'm Aaron Brailsford with the F5 Cert. First up, a cautionary tale on patching quickly, with Mandiant and VMware disclosing that CVE 2023-34048 may have been exploited by attackers as early as 2021, despite only being disclosed and fixed in October 2023. Despite this, I'll dig into a few reasons that keeping up to date with software releases could still keep you out of trouble. Videos from the 37th Annual Chaos Communication Congress are online now, courtesy of the Chaos Computer Club, Europe's oldest hacker collective. I recommend checking out the videos on writing secure software and SMTP smuggling for a novel technique that may empower more convincing phishing campaigns and dive into a little of the history of the CCC. Microsoft disclosed a breach of internal emails, Southern Water disclosed a potential breach but declined to comment on whether data relating to their 4.7 million customers was impacted, and we saw two huge breach data dumps. NAS.API with 70 million unique accounts and almost half of the data being previously unseen, and the mother of all breaches with 12 terabytes of collated breach data from previous dumps. I covered the recent passing of Professor Nicholas Wirth, inventor of the Pascal programming language, and David L. Mills, inventor of the Network Time Protocol, and discussed PXIfail, a suite of new vulnerabilities discovered in a UEFI reference implementation affecting the IPv6 network stack used for pre-boot execution environments, or PXI network booting. Finally, a call to patch for Confluence, VMware, and Ivanti users for several critical vulnerabilities. And more details on all of these things can be found in the This Week in Security article on DevCentral. This Week in Security is written by the F5 Security Incident Response Team for DevCentral and can be found every week under the Technical Articles link. If you found this valuable, please consider subscribing to This Month in Security on any major podcast platform or on our DevCentral YouTube channel, and of course create a login on DevCentral on community.f5.com and check out the articles every week. Again, I'm Aaron Brailsford for the F5 Cert. Have a secure day.
Boy, as somebody that learned programming on Turbo Pascal, that is, of course, a sad day. But I wanted to, take away the sadness, and we're going to get into our roundtable. So get ready for a little bit from Sander, Malcolm, and Aaron. I'm going to bring them on while I go powder my nose or something.
Thanks, Aubrey, for leaving us to it for a little bit. Malcolm and Sander for joining me. I thought I'd pick a few articles that happened in the last month, and we can just talk about them as they go by. And the first thing I wanted to bring up was GitHub paying a $20,000 bounty in the last month or so for some research that had been done into runner images, which that sounds like quite a large number. As bounties go, it's far from the biggest, but it's a pretty big bounty. That was clearly some sizable research that GitHub thought should be handsomely rewarded. I don't know, did either of you guys read the same news?
Yeah, I did. I have to say that I've actually been really impressed with some of the approaches that GitHub has been taking regarding security. Like, they had a huge effort a while back to develop tooling to scan for secrets in GitHub repos that were being exposed, which was a huge problem. And they're not at 100%, but they definitely made a serious impact in that. And so, I'm happy to see that they're paying that kind of a bounty if they think that it's worth it. I think there's maybe an interesting question about how do you price bounties? Is it based on impact? Is it based on amount of research? Is it based on novelty? I don't know, but overall, I thought I was actually kind of excited to see it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, personally speaking, transparency is good, and GitHub seemed to be leaning into transparency pretty heavily. Mm-hmm. And yeah, definitely putting research to the fore, which is also good. Like, secrets in repositories is a huge problem. If anybody can accidentally commit the wrong thing to a repo and shoot themselves in the foot quite handily. So that was good. The runner images thing for me, I'm not a heavy GitHub user, so I had to go and read up on what exactly are runner images, right? And
me too. I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah.
And the way I understand it, they're basically little virtual machines that do your bidding during the process of like the CI/CD pipeline, so build or test or something like that. And compromising one of those images would be bad, right? That's, if you could insert malicious code into a runner image, you've got malicious code that could modify code as it's compiled or steal secrets and exfiltrate them. Not that the secrets should be in your GitHub repo, but
that's a superior way to do it, right? I mean, like, if you can modify the artifacts that are generated from that pipeline without modifying the code that goes into it, you've just added a whole layer of how do we figure out what happened, right? Or it makes detection that much harder.
How would you compare this to poisoning a container image or like a VM image that you're just kind of running in the cloud in normal circumstances? Kind of is this going to, do you think this is going to be significantly more impactful? Is it kind of just the same kind of picture?
it gives you the SolarWinds effect, right? That you can compromise someone's software supply chain relatively invisibly. And I was thinking, like, compromising someone's infrastructure, we have a lot of checks and balances, at least in well postured organizations, to detect that kind of thing. But the runner images, they appear and they disappear. They appear, they do a job, and they disappear. I doubt there's quite as much introspection and inspection going on for those as there is for someone's private cloud infrastructure. And this strikes me as much more effective if you want to get into the software supply chain than, I mean, I've written about this in a bunch of This Week in Securities, all of the typo squatting that you get in Python libraries or Perl libraries, or pick your poison. That requires someone to mistype and include a library that is very definitely not legitimate. That's not necessarily easy to spot, but easy to control if you have tight control of what libraries you use. But yeah, this is going to be invisible to all intents and purposes, I think. Hence the $20,000, I guess.
Yeah. Do you guys remember there was a report that my team published about a year ago now, the Evolving CV Landscape, the one we did with Ben Edwards from Scientia. And one of the sort of more minor findings in that report was towards the back, he found that exploitDB and kind of other similar ways for attack code and exploit code to get distributed, they were all sort of falling off the wagon in favor of GitHub. And it was this sort of finding that attackers actually, I think that they probably prefer that platform for all the same reasons that non-attacker people prefer that platform for storing code, right? And so, it makes me wonder, kind of just we've got attackers storing attack code on GitHub for other attacks. We've got people storing code for running software also on GitHub, and then we have now attackers looking for attack vectors on GitHub. It makes it feel like we're all a little bit closer to each other than it might feel like if we're just talking about disseminating exploits on the dark web or something, So it would be really interesting to know, speaking of transparency, kind of how much awareness GitHub has about malicious activity on their own platform, both in terms of storing and disseminating other exploit code, and also like attack activity against the platform itself, right? I mean, if this thing probably hopefully remained completely theoretical, since it was caught by a researcher, but it'd be interesting to know kind of how much do they know about that.
Yeah, I know they have policies around hosting exploit code on GitHub for exploits that aren't patched or public yet. They go after proof of concepts, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully they have systems that are just looking at everything in GitHub to see what might be an exploit. I don't know, it's hard to spot what might be an exploit if you don't know what the exploit looks like.
That would be tricky. I mean, from a code scanning perspective, a lot of exploits look like I'm going to send an HTTP request with a certain set of parameters. Like, however you can distinguish that from something that calls an API or something, right? And we spent a lot of time obviously scanning code for vulnerabilities, but I've never actually really even thought about scanning code to detect whether or not it's an exploit. That's that's something I got to think about a little bit.
If you were going to do it with ML, I think the first round, or like the first node in my classifier, might just be using known exploits and looking for patterns in the comments that they put there, right? Because they might have subroutines that will look and be named to be completely normal, so that in logs and stuff, it all sort of shows up as completely normal. But hacker comments tend to be a little bit kind of maybe goofier, or they'll sort of, they're like talking about what they're doing. Like, here's where I steal they don't say here's where I steal the PII, but something along those lines, right? I've seen enough of that in exploit code that it might be easier to select on variants in human language than it is to select on variants in machine language.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting point.
I should keep these ideas to myself and do them and not just talk about them. But
Maybe,
anyway.
yeah. Well, I was thinking, I mean, obviously, like, if you're scanning a bunch of code and you see large blobs of hexadecimal values, that are shellcode, that's probably a good sign that maybe you're onto something. Or for that matter, there are certain modules and libraries that are commonly used, maybe not so much by attackers, but by people who are doing exploit dev for a variety of reasons. Like there's a Python one. I want to say it's like PwnKit or something like that. I forget the name of it, but there's
Oh yeah,
sets of libraries that make exploit that are been developed to make exploit dev easier to do. Those might be red flags, or at least yellow flags to say, hey, maybe take a look at this. But then how do you distinguish those things from all of the exploits that are there, that are POCs for already known about, etc.? Like, how do you distinguish NDay from ODay in that sense? Although one wonders, why would you put your ODay on GitHub?
For the same reason why.
For sure. But yeah. It's funny, actually. If I'm looking for proof of concept code, GitHub's one of the first places I go now.
Yeah, me too. Me too, 100%.
The only downside is the fact that at least for a common or popular, I should say, CVE, there'll be hundreds, maybe thousands of repositories that are basically all just the same thing, right? They're JSON blobs of data describing the vulnerabilities over and over and over again. And you're going to try and weed out the POC from all of those. That's intensely frustrating. But yeah, I mean, it used to be ExploitDB or somewhere else that you'd go first, and now every time, first place. If it's not GitHub, it's Twitter or X or whatever we call it now. So in the last month, there's been, every month, right? Dozens of breaches that get disclosed. And I think the notable ones, at least for me in the last month, were Microsoft announcing that they'd had the emails of, in part, their cybersecurity team breached, which is always a bit of a slap in the face. NAS.API and the mother of all breaches. The Microsoft one, we could probably talk longer about the others, but for me, the Microsoft one was technically the most interesting. And again, when it comes to transparency, Microsoft did pretty transparent. I mean, they had to disclose this breach, right? Yeah. So that forces a level of transparency. But I was reading literally the article from the blog post from yesterday, at the time that we record this, on Microsoft's website, where they described how the threat actors got in pretty much step by step, right? And we know that we already knew prior to this blog, they'd use password spraying to compromise a test account, I think it was. And this was an old piece of infrastructure that was set up prior to their current guidelines. But I'll just read this piece of the blog post out and we can talk about that. So they leveraged their initial access to identify and compromise a legacy test OAuth application that had elevated access to the Microsoft corporate environment. That sounds bad. They created additional malicious OAuth applications. Then they created a new user account to grant consent in the corporate environment to the actor-controlled malicious OAuth application. And then they used the legacy test OAuth application to grant them Office 365 Exchange Online full access as app role, which allowed them access to mailboxes. This sounds like several missteps. Right? So, a new user account was created and nobody noticed. The new user account could grant consent, which, I don't know. If you just created a user account, and I believe that's against their current guidelines as well. There was a number of missteps, and I'm not going to be too harsh on them here. We all have like skeletons hiding in the closet when it comes to old applications and stuff that was developed internally and so on and so forth. But yeah, it struck me how relatively easily it sounds like these attackers were able to gain access to sensitive emails and then exfiltrate them from the org.
Mm-hmm. You know what this is reminding me of is something that I just heard from a buddy of mine the other day, which I wasn't aware of. Some organization, this is less of a organization for getting an old app, but it's similar in some ways because some organizations actually create a dummy Active Directory domain admin account. Like maybe they call it administrator or whatever. With the idea that that would be something that an attacker would go for if they were in the environment, and then they can monitor the logs or set up monitoring so that they can see who's accessing that account and kind of get a distant early warning. That's an interesting and probably pretty useful idea, except for the fact that at least in one organization that my friend had worked with, they actually created the dummy admin account with admin privileges. And so the attacker just went ahead and used it, right? It's like
they almost got it right, but
almost, yeah, almost so close.
Oh man.
Yeah. So I mean, just it goes to the point of like, all this stuff is actually really, it's hard to get all the little bits and pieces right, and you kind of have to. Certainly this account in Microsoft's environment should not have been able to grant privileges to other things. There's a whole bunch of things that it should not have been able to do or been able to be allowed to do. One can easily see in a demanding, fast-paced environment, which I'm sure Microsoft is, where you just forget about a thing, or it was set up that way briefly for testing or for debugging something, and then somebody forgot to take the permissions off or whatever, right? It's a constant battle to make sure that you're not introducing these things into your environment by accident. And
I was talking with somebody maybe a month ago who had worked for several years in Microsoft Incident Response, and he was just talking about the volume of data that they dealt with every day, the number of sheer events, and he just said it was kind of unlike anything he's ever seen before since, and that they had to deal with the number of false positives or alerts that they had to deal with were as many as the number of total events that most other organizations have to deal with, right? So it's I
bet
the scale here is also, I think, just kind of a factor, is getting a single pane of glass over that, or getting, like, let's say that alert about that new user role had I mean, it's possible they had that alert and it went out, and just the mailbox that went to isn't monitored anymore. That person left, or isn't, there's just so many different variables here. It's you understand why they're putting so much money into AI, is that I think increasingly it's going to be the only way that they're gonna manage that volume of data.
Yeah, so this strikes me as we're all only one tiny misstep away from complete disaster when it comes to cybersecurity. Anyway, and I did a training earlier at one of a mandatory organization training, and the comment was something like, if the human is breached, you are one step away. You're that one step away from the entire organization being breached, which is, I mean, that sounds awful, right? It's words designed to instill fear and compliance into people. But if we are all only one step away from complete disaster, then how do you catch that, right? That's there needs to be more technological guardrails, because humans are human and we all make multiple mistakes a day, or at least I do.
Yeah.
And if one of those mistakes compromises the entire organization, we need a way to stop that. But like you just said, Sander, in a big organization, the way to stop that is alerting. But if you're getting 6 million alerts a day, how do you even see the bad thing?
Right. And what you just said, that we're only one step away from disaster, that is the literal opposite of defense in depth. And defense in depth is one of the first things that they teach you in this field is we're supposed to have redundancy and we're supposed to have defense in depth and like I even wrote a whole paper in grad school about like polymodal redundancy, so like different tech to achieve the same goal so that they fail in different ways, blah blah blah, and just this like kind of simple idea turns out to be a lot harder in practice to get into every single form and every single kind of attack surface, right? Kind of wild to think that we're still there.
Yeah, for all of our tech, we are one step away from complete disaster, it seems.
Well, maybe not one, maybe two or three, but still, I mean, actually the Microsoft thing shows that it's not that the attackers just basically found this app and immediately went to their goal. They had to work a little bit at it. So there were multiple points where somebody maybe could have seen something. Multiple points that an alert could have been generated. But as Sandra points out, if it's one or two events in an event stream that is, hundreds of millions of events per day or billions of events per day or whatever it happens to be, that how do you even guarantee that's looked at or reviewed adequately or anything else? So yeah, we work in a difficult field, I guess.
Yeah. Doesn't Microsoft kind of have their own auth framework that is like a competitor to OAuth? Oh, Aubrey says it's Active Directory Federation Services. Thanks, Aubrey. I'm curious what they were using OAuth for in their own environment and kind of whether the threat actor went in with some plan about that and said, I'm going to hit him right in the OAuth, or if they came in and said, oh, it's OAuth, I've been poning this all month and here we go, this will be easy. Like it would be curious to go under the hood a little bit.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And an interesting thought. ADFS, speaking of Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS always just makes me think of a completely different ADFS. Possibly because I'm old. I am thinking of the Advanced Disk Filing System, which was not Amigas, but Acorn Archimedes. Oh, right. So the predecessors to the ARM chips that's in all of our phones. To Microsoft's credit, I will say that the blog post I referenced, that I'm sure we'll include in the description for all of this, has good advice for defending against exactly what they encountered. Right? So not only are they obviously internally learning from their mistakes, they are telling everybody else how to learn from their mistakes, which I think is to be applauded.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Leading from the front. That's good.
100%. Yeah. Speaking of large amounts of data, you make a nice segue.
Yeah, I was going to link us with the password spraying bit, but you're right. They both work. To NAS.API and the mother of all breaches that hit the news, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I guess. With something like, what was it in NAS.API, 70 million records? And the mother of all breaches was, here we go, 26 billion records, which is just blows my mind. These breaches like this obviously make attacks like credential stuffing an awful lot easier and probably more successful. But I know, since you're both in F5 Labs, you tend to look at data behind these kind of things, like what's in these actual breaches. So you've probably got some thoughts for us.
Yeah, my immediate reaction when I saw this was I thought back to a report that we published in November. One of the things we did in that identity report was we wanted to just get a sense of all the credentials we see being used in attacks, how many of them were known ahead of time to have been breached. And the short answer is that we didn't know about a lot of them ahead of the time. And the spread between organizations was really big. Some of them had 0% overlap. Every single cred used in an attack was novel as far as our own leaked cred check service was concerned. Some of them, it was like 75 to 80%, which is kind of what I expected it all to be. So my first reaction was, for all of the laudable efforts of people like Troy Hunt, and then the services and the businesses that are kind of supporting that, collecting up all these creds on the dark web and notifying people and stuff. It sounds to me like we're just kind of scraping the surface, and so or scraping the surface may be too reductive, but we don't have great coverage there. And so when I saw something like 35% of the email addresses of the unique emails in that NAS.API one were completely novel to Troy Hunt's service. That was sort of just another piece of evidence in that. I thought that I don't know if we need just more effort here, or if we need a completely novel approach to detecting stolen creds. But so that's kind of, I think our own findings plus this has sort of changed the way that I'm looking at that economy.
Yeah, and I can add that as we were talking about in the pre-show a little bit, it made me really wonder about how various services that do offer checking for known compromised credentials obtain the data that they use, and how in terms of the total, like if you imagine the total amount of breach credentials that are available somewhere by somebody, known to someone, how deep into that do we actually see as an industry? And my impression is that we don't see very deeply, maybe at all. Which I can speculate is, well, if I breach a company and I get a bunch of new creds, or have some means of obtaining that data, I'm going to probably either use it for my own purposes or maybe share it with a small group of people who I trust. And by the time it gets to the point where it's being sold on the dark web or being posted on a forum or something, it's already pretty old. I don't quite know. I mean, these things don't come with dates on them, so it's hard to necessarily kind of reverse engineer where it is. I mean, for what it's worth, I went and checked my own accounts against the NAS API, and I was in there, but it was for stuff that was probably 10 years old for me. So I mean, not to say that it isn't like 20 or however much it was net new, but I think we probably are going to need to up our game as an industry in terms of our sort of what would that be, counterintelligence work to get access to more of this earlier if we're going to really try to make a dent with any protective measures that are based on checking for previously compromised creds.
That's both of you raise an interesting point there. I wonder if that damages the sales proposition, if you like, of leaked credential checking services. Like, would we be better served putting more energy into, is the person inputting that password behaving the way that I normally see that person behave? Those kind of like, is it a real user? Does their typing cadence match their normal typing cadence? Right. Those kind of checks. Versus, did I see this password in a breach dump that I might not have got access to? Mm-hmm. And obviously, moving away from just password-based auth, right, to something more modern and less susceptible to being breached.
To be honest with you, I had a thought right away when I was first starting to read about the NAS API breach, which was, I see people checking I see doing checks on somebody submitting creds. We're going to check it to see whether those sorts of services. What I haven't seen, and even my password manager will check to see whether or not any of the creds that I'm using have been exposed, in the breaches they know about. But I haven't ever seen in a account creation scenario checking to see whether or not the password that I'm trying to use is one that shows up in any of these, which might prevent me from reusing passwords or from using a password like Spring 2024 or whatever. I mean, that might comply with whatever the password requirements are, but also be terrible. And I wonder why that is. I kind of
thought maybe it would be difficult to do a search through that in as rapid enough a way to be able to give the feedback immediately, or it might just be really frustrating and drive people away from signing up for your site. There may be some economic or business considerations going on here. I'm not really sure, but ultimately I came to the same conclusion as you, Aaron, which is let's just stop using these password things. They're terrible and they don't work very well. As soon as possible, please. So, yeah,
especially because I saw a thing on LinkedIn the other day where somebody had sort of posted a question about YubiKeys and basically saying, do these things work, and are they all that they're cracked up to be? And then there was a long discussion about whether they work or not. And my first thought was, it's kind of the wrong question. That really what it is about is the protocols that YubiKey is working with. And those are kind of, assuming that the devs behind YubiKey have done a good job with it, then those protocols is kind of where everything is hanging. And those are in principle really similar to TLS and web encryption. And TLS and web encryption is actually, I would say, like kind of one of the great successes that we've had in the last couple of years in terms of a new approach using cryptography it kind of changed the game and changed network security, right? And of course, we see people misconfigure or mess up or just have legacy stuff with TLS. It's not always perfect, but it's I think still greatly successful. And so I think the reason I'm so hopeful about passwordless auth and passkeys and all these kind of new authentication formats is essentially not because it's not really about a product. It's not about any specific piece of tech. It's about the protocols and standards behind them, and those are good. Those are really kind of well-founded.
Yeah.
It'll be I think the thing for me is how much resistance is there in the general public, right? Because that's most of these breach passwords are coming from services that we as the general public use rather than applications we use in a corporate environment that they're more strictly controlled. And how do you get, let's use my mother as an example here. How do I get my mother to use some kind of passwordless auth for services when she is only just used to the idea of passwords?
Do you think that the regular population could be convinced to just wear a little token like on a lanyard around their neck and they just plug it in and hit a button every time they log in? Or would that feel too much like a dog tag and like some sort of apocalyptic, horrible future that we've definitely landed in?
Interesting question.
Yeah, maybe we should just have a QR code tattooed on our forehead that the webcam can,
I've seen NFC rings and I've been tempted, but that
is kind of interesting.
In the UK, I was relate this to like the banking sector, but there's 3 kinds of MFA that I've come across in the UK in online banking. And one is good old SMS based MFA. That's still pretty popular. Yeah. 2 is the, what are they called? Pin Sentry. So you get a little, what a friend of mine calls the Fisher-Price My First Calculator that you put your debit card into. And it uses the chip on the debit card to give you a one-time passcode with your PIN number. That's widely deployed across a number of banks. And then the third thing, we're probably going back at least a decade now. Lloyd's trialed RSA tokens, and they had a trial group, and they literally mailed you an RSA token that you used to log into your online banking. They abandoned that and went back to SMS-based MFA because people just didn't get along with it. Right? So that's not glowing...
super shocking.
Yeah. And we're going back a decade and people change and it used to crack me up that the trial group, both my parents and I at the time, banked with Lloyd's. My parents, who were in their probably 60s at that point, were in the trial group and I wasn't. And I get that from a point of view of, we'll trial this with people who are less tech savvy, but they don't know.
Yeah.
It just amused me that The trial group included my parents in their 60s, and not me.
Not the early adopters. Yeah, the people who really care and understand. Yeah.
For what it's worth, in the U.S. at least in my experience, often two-factor authentication is not turned on by default or required by default. It is often somewhat difficult to find out how to turn it on. And when you do, most commonly it's SMS. Only a few of my financial institutions support anything other than that. And nevertheless, though, I'm hopeful. I mean, more devices are coming out with the ability to have sort of integrated passkey workflows in them. A Macintosh with a Touch ID is very convenient for it, and I think that should hopefully lower the bar to entry as that sort of thing gets deployed more. I hope.
Yeah, I think both in. Sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
No, go on, Sam.
I think the biometrics, both in the mobile, like I'm actually seeing more good auth be implemented on mobile apps than I am seeing it on desktop browser stuff. And I think that's partly just because the biometric is right there.
Yep.
And I mean, with Mac OS, you also have the Touch ID on the thing, but biometrics aren't perfect, and we've been dissecting their limitations for more than a decade now. But it does kind of seem like we're maybe on the verge of a kind of a public acceptance breakthrough with this kind of stuff. Don't know, but for sure, I think the biometrics and the mobile are that's at least where people seem to be putting more of their efforts in this.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, if we're lucky, by this time in 2025, we will not still be discussing breach passwords.
Wouldn't that be great?
Here's
hoping.
And on that, we will stop chatting about the news of the last month, and we can bring Aubrey back in to. Now he's finished powdering his nose.
Oh yeah, I'm done. Yeah, thank you. Hi. So hey, before actually totally unplanned, I figured I'd just keep you guys on for a second before we roll the next segment. I wanted to know. I think you've all played 5th edition D&D. Is that right?
I have not.
I played no, 5th edition. No,
5th. Okay.
I've played 3rd and a half or whatever Pathfinder is.
Oh yeah, Pathfinder. Okay.
Yeah.
How about you, Malcolm? Where are you up to?
1st edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is the last version that I played.
Oh, that's going back. Nice. I was
kind of a flex there, isn't it, Malcolm?
A little bit. Sorry.
I was mostly a 2nd edition AD&D guy myself, but I figured I would just take a moment again because of the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, 50th birthday, if you will, of Dungeons and Dragons in January of 2024. I wanted to ask you guys what your favorite character class is. If you had a favorite character class to play whenever you played, it doesn't even matter what edition it was. So without putting anyone on the spot, Malcolm first.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think I tended to go for either just fighters or sometimes a paladin would be groovy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got to get religion. All right. Aaron?
So I have never played Dungeons and Dragons of any kind. I know, shocking, right?
We're gonna have to change that.
So I'm just gonna go back to an old 8-bit video game, which was like one of my favorite games when I was a kid, which was called Attic Attack, or Attic Attack, I guess, which had 3 character classes: Knight, Wizard, and Serf. And I basically always played as. It was from the 80s. So always played as the wizard.
Okay. So wizards, very powerful. I like the idea of Serf. That's fantastic. And Sander, do you recall any? I'm just curious.
Usually Ranger. I like a Ranger class. I also have a soft spot for the monk, like the martial arts style monk, which I don't even know how early that got introduced. But by the time I started playing, monk was the mainstay, and I like the monk. But I think given the option, I'd always go for Ranger.
Yeah, I'll tell you, like there's something about having like a monk with like bracers, like magic bracers, so you got a better armor class. You're the guy with no armor walking into the battle. Like it was always so.
I love it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I'm a big fan of monks myself. I think probably for me, just in case anyone was curious, I'm like over time, I guess Druid was probably a good one for me early on. But recently, I have actually been more towards Bard.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, there's something about that ability to like, you know, I irked my DM over, over COVID, I'm sure, because I would just be like, you know, when it would get to my turn, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna, start doing this song, and like I'm just going into battle, like, playing songs and describing how I'm doing that. It's just neat.
Yeah.
It's a different way to.
I will say that in the edition, like the first edition that I'm the most familiar with, in order to become a bard, you had to get some levels of fighter and some levels of magic user and some levels of thief or something like that before you could even start leveling in bard. And later editions changed it so it was just a class like any other, and I think that was great.
Yeah.
And I've played and heard of people doing really, really fun things with bards, so I'm happy to see that change, because when I was playing, at least originally, nobody ever did bard because it was too hard to get to. Right.
I recall that. I think they did away with that in second edition, but I could be mistaken. I never played bards. Back then I didn't want to play a bard. It just wasn't interesting to me. I was a kid. So, and these days, just again, another one. I'm the current character I'm playing right now, because I do play 5th edition every once in a while. Honestly, I'm putting it out there because D&D really saved me during COVID. It was something to look forward to every single week with a group of people that I loved hanging out with. And right now I am playing a thief cleric split class. So interesting idea to have a priest that's actually a thief. So
yeah, I like it.
And on that note, I'm going to say thank you to you guys so much for coming on again this month. It's always great doing it with you guys, and I'm going to kind of roll into my next video. So I'll see you guys next month.
Yep. See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. And on that note, I think the next thing that I've got up is a quick segment. Actually, I can't play the whole thing. We've only got about 10 minutes of video. This interview for me turned out to be an extremely long interview. I did not want to slow his roll because Daniel Wolf is a really, really smart guy. He is one of our DevCentral MVPs. He's a repeat DevCentral MVP, so the guy is really, really, really good at traffic management already. And he had a really interesting concept. We happened to be chatting, and he talked to me about a process that he goes through with his customers, where essentially you go from SBOM to WAF policy, right? Because I think a lot of us are used to building, if you're busy doing WAF stuff, Web App Firewall stuff, a lot of the time you put things in transparent mode and you just try and figure out what the false positives are. But on heavy traffic sites, that can be very difficult. So you end up kind of breaking things up into multiple policies, and you get policy sprawl, which is difficult, and you don't really have any onus that falls on any one particular person. It's really a tough thing. So Daniel's idea of going from SBOM, preferably, right? I mean, at a minimum, they start with a web application inventory, which you'll see in this interview, but preferably SBOM all the way up into a web app firewall policy. And if you want to check out the full interview, you got to check that out on the DevCentral YouTube. But for now, here's 10 minutes of myself with Daniel Wolf. So I guess what really made me want to talk to you about this was the idea that you could take an SBOM and essentially come up with WAF policy. And I know it's not exactly SBOM that you start with. It's more of like a web app inventory. That's right, Daniel?
Yeah, that's right. So the ideal case is SBOM, but typically customers, they have at least a clue what kind of web applications they have, how many of them. And then from this inventory, in an ideal case, they already had a risk assessment. If not, we can help them to make a risk assessment, can give them some tools at the end to figure out how risky their apps are. Like my typical examples are, you have, for example, the menu of the cafeteria, totally not risky. Your company GitHub or some other thing, crown jewels. They are like with the highest risk. And then we try to figure out which app belongs into which category.
Now that's I'm curious because we've talked a little bit about on the podcast. We've talked a little bit about the OpenSSF and their initiatives on helping whoever out there get SBOMs together. Right, they're looking at helping the world craft an understanding of what software they have in their inventory. I'm curious, when you're out there in the world working with customers, do you find that people have SBOMs complete, or are they like in process still?
It really depends, on customer size, scale of the organization, maturity of the organization. There are some surprises, like small companies where you would not expect it, and also other surprises, big company where you would expect it, but then they don't, because it's just like the organization by itself is so big that the IT cannot keep track, and there's too much shadow IT going on. Yeah.
That's something funny. We just talked a little bit about shadow APIs last month on the podcast. That is something that we're finding is a huge threat in those, especially in those big organizations you talk about, right? I mean, you lose track. I've been in a big organization before, and we lost track really easily, as evidenced by one of the systems I worked on getting hacked when I was a very young administrator, right? We didn't know what version of PHP was on that box. Really had no concept, but the people that were poking around at our environment, they definitely knew what version of PHP was on that ticketing system and cracked us wide open.
They're really, now it's really easy to make a fingerprint of applications. There are many open source tools, like just start from OpenCRT to find out which certificates are issued. Then you go along, check, are these hosts in use? Are they protected by a WAF? Make a WAF fingerprinting, and then the attacker already has a pretty good clue without making a lot of noise that you would notice him. No? So it's very crucial to have insights in your applications. Also to have SBOM there. The other day I found an OWASP tool that will help you to make SBOM. Also very good.
Cyclone DX.
That was the name, right?
That was it. Okay. Yeah, that's an exciting new project. I guess I'm not sure if you knew, but I started working with OWASP on AI stuff mostly. But
I'm mostly also OWASP member, but just a paying member without any involvement.
Well, Cyclone DX is a great new project, from what I understand. I don't have the time to work on it, but of course, I urge everyone to check out projects if they can. So listeners, if you're out there, right, Cyclone DX is a really great OWASP project. If you don't want to go forth and purchase something to help you make your SBOM. So you have a method then by which you take an application, a web app inventory, and then kind of move into a WAP policy, I shouldn't say a WAP policy, right?
Once we have the assessment or the list complete, then the next step would be like to move on to get a risk assessment done and so on.
Awesome. So, if you, I was really interested in kind of showing that. I know you have a couple of slides.
So practically we call it from web application inventory to successful web application security. So we figured out that customers have some typical challenges when they start with the Web Application Firewall and they want to go into production, into blocking mode. So they don't go for the low-hanging fruits. Very often they want to achieve like top-tier security on day one, and then they just take a too big bite. They get tired of false positives, and the policy never goes into blocking mode. Also, a WAF is a beast. We know that. You cannot just have one or two people that are kind of the network guys and at the same time they take care of the WAF. You need a team of experts, and yeah, it's difficult to find them. You need personnel, or you simplify to a level that it's maintainable with a smaller set of people. And then the third one is that often there's a difficulty in communication, NetOps, SecOps, development. Then also new methods like agile release cycles are shorter, and you just cannot keep track that your policy is always up to date. A new feature might come on a new URI set. You have to add this to the WAF policy. Another feature might retire. It's difficult, and you cannot do this for all the applications. So the approach that we take, and we try to categorize, like the customer needs to have an inventory of their web applications and APIs. And once they have that, they should conduct a risk assessment. Is this an application that is associated with a low risk, a medium risk, or a high risk? That's how we try to categorize applications in general. And from this, we go then and craft policies with them. We try to attach this level of protection or the level of criticality of the application with what kind of protection features we enable for this application. So on a WAF, you might have IP intelligence that will work on the lower layers, layer 3, layer 4. You will have methods for bot detection and bot mitigation. You will have layer 7 DDoS protection. On a particular WAF, you will have a product that is called threat campaigns. You will have attack signatures. And then you go like in the top tier, which has positive security and which requires a deep understanding of the application and of web applications in general. Yeah, you have to understand what is the request, what is the response, is this a false positive, is it an attack, is it an attack in the context of the application. I've seen customers that they had an application that in a certain area, it was a CMS, you could post SQL code. So the WAF would naturally block SQL injection, but it was a CMS and you were supposed to post SQL code in this particular area. So this was an attack signature that for this particular URI subset must be disabled.
And also for those who aren't familiar with threat campaigns, it's a rather neat idea that will kind of protect you live from the big campaigns that are out there right now. So if we're aware of anything big that's happened in the world, we want to offer automatic protection to any other web properties that might be out there. So that is handy. Absolutely.
That's really a neat feature, because it's so tailored to a particular attack, there's no false positive, and you can actually enable it and go to hang out with friends or to bed, whatever you are in mood to.
Yeah, well, as a person, I've administered a WAF before in very small scale, and I would have loved to have had some automated defenses from the big stuff that was out there, because I had to craft policy every day. I would look at what kind of hits I got.
All right. Well, that was really just the beginning of that one. We didn't even get through half of that interview. So if you enjoyed that, definitely check that out. It's at community.f5.com, also known as DevCentral. Wanted to thank Daniel Wolf again from Controlware for joining me this month. Really, Daniel, it's always great to get to talk to you, and I'll see you coming up in California at App World. Another reminder, we do have F5 App World coming up in San Jose. If you happen to be out in the area, please stop by and check it out. I will be talking about AI quite a bit while I'm out there. So hopefully I will see you there. And if not, then definitely you'll see me next month in security.
Thanks for checking out This Month in Security. Again, I'm your host, Aubrey King with DevCentral, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If so, I hope you'd click like, or maybe even click subscribe, or consider writing a review or a comment. This Month in Security is a DevCentral podcast, community supported. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you next month.